Hello, this video is designed to help you sleep or relax. There will only be 4 ads after the first 4 stories, and the rest of your time here will be ad-free. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to be notified when new videos just like this are released. Now, let's begin. This happened about 15 years ago. I was 21 years old and living in my very first apartment. It was a small bachelor apartment in a sketchy area. I grew up in a town that was known to be rough and tough. I knew how to handle myself and learned at a young age to keep my head down and not go looking for trouble. My apartment building was behind a bar. A lot of the customers of the bar would stand outside to smoke. When they stood outside to smoke, they would be looking at my apartment. Most of the people who were out smoking kept to themselves. A few would nod and say hello if passed by. Never any issues. Until one evening. I came home from work. I passed the bar and saw this extremely tall man outside smoking. As I passed, he just stared at me. I gave him a slight nod, but he did not acknowledge it. He just continued to stare. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. About an hour later, I hear a knock on my door. It was odd because you have to buzz people into the building. The building only had 8 units, and I didn't really know any of the neighbors. I froze because I really didn't want to talk to anyone. But the knocking continued. I finally shouted, "Who is it?" But there was no response. I shouted again, "Who's there?" And the voice said, "It's Tom." I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I shouted back, "I don't know anyone named Tom. You must have the wrong apartment." The voice then said, "You may not know me, but I know you. Open up so we can talk." I went over to the peephole, and it was the tall dude from the bar. I loudly said, "Screw off or I'm calling the cops." I heard his footsteps walk away and heard the building door open and then close. He was gone. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, I peeked out the window and he was standing in the parking lot. He seemed to be talking to himself. At this point, I am freaking out. I called my landlord who lived in the building next to me. He told me to call the police, and that in the meantime, him and his brother would come check things out. I call the police and tell them what's going on. They said a car is on the way. Meanwhile, my landlord and his brother make their way to the parking lot. I watch out my window and see them approach the guy. The guy takes one look at them and bolts. My landlord and his brother try to chase him, but the tall guy got away. About 5 minutes later, the police arrive. I give my version of events and also a description of the man. The officer just blankly looks at me and says, "We've had reports of a man matching that description who has been preying on women. You should be very glad you didn't open the door." A few days later, I get a call from the officer. He told me part of their investigation was talking to the owner of the bar. The owner called the police when the tall guy reappeared after a few days, and the police responded and arrested him. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that was it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I have never been the biggest fan of swimming, but This YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won, but instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured we would just get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course, we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass, and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to make sure that you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door, you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, and so we couldn't see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob, but I knew she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin agreed that we should leave so we could get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening. I then let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp, and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin, as she's a couple of years younger than me. I looked at the clock and saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again, and saw the lifeguard still, just staring out straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we needed out, and banging on the door as hard as I could. But still, nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to go sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped only a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with a towel over her head, not moving or saying anything. so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon, because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon. But there was this little voice in my head telling me, maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire, and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna, and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way, and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that for sure she had locked us in there, because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door, and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, we were trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back in. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before my grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making dinner, and I told them the story of what just happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her end game? I'm 21 now, but I think about this interaction all the time. And when I'm in small spaces or when I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one believes this story, and I get it. It is pretty absurd. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but do you think that this could have been some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think that she really just left us in there to die? And why? My childhood best friend Marie and I were around 11 or 12 years old at the time. Marie's family had their own campsite in a provincial park about 2 hours from our hometown, and would spend the entire summer each year living in their camper out there. This particular summer, I was able to go and stay with them for a week, and we were excited to spend our time adventuring around the forest. On the last night that I was there, we decided we wanted to hurry down to the ice cream shop by the lake before it closed. It was early evening at this point, still pretty bright out, but beginning to lose light. The path we took was down a short slope right next to the main road, with maybe 10 feet of thick brush and trees in between. On the other side was the forest, with more tall, thick brush. So we were walking along, not seeing a single other person on the path in front or behind us. We hear a sudden rustling and snapping of branches, similar to the sound of maybe a deer moving through the woods. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but then, the sound of running footsteps follows. Marie glances back and suddenly grabs my arm, urging me under her breath not to look back. At the same time, the running stops. I don't know why I didn't ignore her and get a look myself. I guess I could sense the very real fear in her voice, and chose to listen. We both start to panic, getting that feeling like when you're running up the stairs after turning the basement light off. We pick up speed as much as we can without breaking into a sprint, knowing the ice cream shop is only about a minute walk away at this point. The path soon breaks, and we are in the parking lot. Suddenly, Marie steers me hard to the left, heading towards the lake and the boat rental instead of continuing straight to the ice cream shop, and I go along with it silently, understanding ice cream is no longer an interest right now. Marie is clearly panicking at this point. We are both looking around, but it seems whatever scared her is nowhere in sight at this point. Marie walks up to the boat rental and gets us a kayak, and we climb in and begin to paddle out into the middle of the lake. As we paddle, she tells me that there was a man behind us, and that the man had stopped running at us very abruptly upon making eye contact with her. He had been wearing a long black coat with the hood up, despite it being the middle of July, had a terrible smirk on his face, and she swore that as he stopped running, she saw him put something shiny away into his coat. He appeared to have just emerged out of the bushes after we walked past, given the sounds we heard right before he came running up. We reach the center of the lake and stop paddling. I pull out my Nokia brick phone that my parents had, thankfully, given to me just in case. I hand it to Marie and tell her to call her parents to come pick us up. As the phone rings, I see her look out past me to the shore and go pale, lifting a hand to point at what she was seeing. I turn, and there was the man, stalking his way around the path that circled the edge of the lake, staring out at us. We sat in the middle of the lake and watched him do 2 full laps, never looking away from us, before finally disappearing. It took a few tries to get a hold of her family. We were freaking out so bad the whole time, as the sun got lower and lower. We did manage to have someone come with the truck, but by the time we reached the shore, it was pretty dark outside. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't been able to call for a ride. Looking back, I don't know why we didn't just go up to the ice cream shop, inform an adult there, and ask her parents to come get us then. But it worked out. We got back safe, and we thankfully never saw that man again. A little background on me. I'm a 19-year-old male, and I was traveling with my girlfriend. We were on a road trip to visit my grandparents who lived a few states away. They said we could stay at their place for a few weeks over the summer, and it seemed like a no-brainer because they lived on the beach. The path to getting there, though, was really long, and it was a painful drive. My girlfriend and I both dislike driving, but we figured that we could take turns, and it wouldn't be so miserable. I think the total time on the road was about 10 hours. We were about 5 hours into the drive when we decided to stop off at a rest stop. I'm not going to lie to you, we stopped quite a bit. I'm a little compulsive with drinking water because I like to stay hydrated. As you might imagine, there are some consequences of being hydrated. This one rest area was not horrible or anything. Wasn't in a bad area or anything like that, but this is where one of the most horrifying experiences of my life took place. At least the first part of it. This has simply been one of the many times when I had to pull off the road to go pee. When I saw that there was also a McDonald's near this one rest area, I decided to wait until we got there. I normally don't eat McDonald's, but I let myself do it on special occasions like road trips. It makes the drive go by a little bit better, even if it makes my stomach feel like garbage. So I went to the bathroom and she bought more cigarettes. We had already made our way to the McDonald's when we had our first appearance with this creepy guy. We actually did talk to him a little bit. Let's go ahead and call him Joe. Joe may have been the strangest looking man I have ever laid my eyes on. He looked like he didn't come from this country, and not on a racial basis or anything. He just looked like he had a completely different lifestyle, as if he lived off the land and had never used electricity. His beard went all the way down to his stomach, and if you looked at it long enough, you could see food particles in there, and some of them not even from a meal that he had eaten that day. So that should give you a good idea of his level of cleanliness. The rest of his outfit followed suit. A dark pair of jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in a decade, and a large leather jacket that looks like the oldest thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm sure it actually wasn't that old, but it had a timely appearance due to it being in such poor condition. Anyway, we spoke to Joe because he awkwardly sat right next to us at McDonald's. I thought this was extremely strange, and it definitely weirded me out. I am an introvert by nature, and talking to people is extremely taxing. My girlfriend is an extrovert and always attracted people that were interested in conversation. I just found it strange because I have never had someone randomly sit at the same table as me when they were complete strangers. I figured that it was because my girlfriend attracted talkers, but looking back, it was probably because we appeared to be easy targets. Joe sat down right next to my girlfriend and started asking us where we were going. My girlfriend, being the optimistic and unsuspecting person that she is, gave him the entire story, that we were basically 5 hours away from anyone that we knew in any given direction. I tried to give her a look that she needed to shut up, but she did not get the hint. We had already ordered our food, and we were eating when he sat down. He didn't order anything. He just invited himself to our table and talked to us for the entire time we were there. At first, he was rather polite, but had a really thick accent that didn't seem like it belonged anywhere. I couldn't tell you where that accent came from because I have never heard anything like it in my life. And this is coming from someone who knows plenty of people from the North, Midwest, the South, Australia, and anywhere else. This accent just didn't seem like it came from Earth. After a painful experience of trying to get away from Joe, we got back in our car and started our journey again. As we got to our car, I also noticed that Joe had gotten into his car as well. As we had pulled out, Joe was a good distance away from us. I thought this was strange, and the warning sign in my head went from flashing to high alert. I knew deep down that we were in some kind of danger. I was driving, and I tried putting the pedal to the metal. The next half hour or so, I had probably sped more than I did in my entire life. I was normally a really safe driver, but this guy was really creeping me out. I tried telling my girlfriend that he was tailing us, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was just being paranoid. But what are the odds at seeing this guy at a McDonald's, and then him being behind us for 30 minutes after we get on the road? She told me to pull over at the next rest stop, and we would know for sure if he was following us. Stupidly, that's exactly what I did. And my worst suspicion was true. He pulled off at the same rest stop and parked right next to us. My adrenaline was rushing as I got ready to fight this guy. I didn't know what else I could do. I told my girlfriend to call the police, and then I got out of the car. He was easily a foot taller than me, but he was a little older and probably not in the best shape. I had the benefit of being an athlete wannabe at my college. I was in pretty decent shape, but none of that mattered when Joe pulled out a knife. There was an immediate understanding between the two of us at that moment. The understanding that he was out to do us harm, and I was going to have to defend us. I waited for him to approach. About 30 seconds went by before he started walking in my direction. My heart was absolutely pounding. I started screaming every insult that I could. I called him a degenerate, an old man who was in way over his head. It didn't scare him though, and when he got within 10 feet of me, I thought it would be a good idea to tackle him. I was hoping to take him by surprise, but I didn't. I tried getting him off his feet and onto the floor, but when I tackled him, he plunged the knife into my back. But that was the only good hit he got. I managed to get him on the floor, and after that I started kicking his head ferociously. I don't know how I managed to do it, but he was on the ground, seemingly unconscious, and I was standing there. I could feel the blood flowing down my back, and I got back into the backseat of my car and yelled at my girlfriend to drive me to the nearest hospital. I was questioned a few days later at the hospital about what had happened. I guess the police showed up after we had left and found Joe still there, unconscious. He was in a coma, and the police didn't know what to think. Once they got mine and my girlfriend's version of the story, they did seem to believe us. So that was that. I don't know if Joe ever woke up from that coma. And honestly, after he almost killed me, I kinda hope he didn't. That was an extremely traumatic experience. The good news about the situation is that I can tell people that I put someone in a coma once. And if they don't listen to me, they're next. I have always been a fan of horror stories and true crime, which is why it was so strange to have my own experience. So, a little background on me. I'm a 20-year-old male college student. I attend a local community college and live at home. My local area includes garbage pickup, but here's the problem. We have a really big piece of property. Our driveway is a good long walk from the house itself. We normally throw garbage into the garbage cans that are just outside of our house, and then on garbage days, I have to take the garbage cans all the way down near to the road so the garbage man can get them. It's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's not the end of the world. Some of my friends have to bring their own garbage to the local garbage dump, and I'm just happy I don't have to do that. If you're a college student, you probably understand the struggle of maintaining a healthy sleep schedule. If I'm going to be honest with you, I really don't have one. I kind of sleep when I'm tired, and I'm awake when I'm not. Sometimes I get my schoolwork done early in the morning, like 3 a.m., and sometimes it's in the afternoon after class. It really just depends. My horror story begins with me bringing down the garbage cans late at night. What almost always happens is that I don't remember to bring down the cans until the night before, at like 11 p.m., or sometimes later. This means that I'm making multiple trips back and forth, carrying heavy garbage cans in the pitch black. I mentioned that I like horror earlier, but I don't consider myself to be someone that's scared easily. The night and darkness does not scare me very much. I've had a few experiences where I will hear a noise or imagine that I see something out of the corner of my eye, but it's never been anything horrible. I never imagined that I'd have a bad experience carrying the garbage cans until this last summer. It must have been about 2 a.m., and I was moving a really heavy can of trash. It felt like it was at least 100 pounds, full of kitty litter. Why, you might ask? My family has 5 cats. Don't even ask. That wouldn't have been an issue, but all of this kitty litter was in the worst trash can that we could have. The wheels both fell off. So, I was pulling this ridiculously heavy garbage can full of kitty litter that stinks to the high heavens. I get about halfway down my driveway, and of course, the handlebar rips off. The entire can fell over, and at least 1/3 of everything came out into the driveway. I cursed under my breath and just stood there for a moment wondering what I was going to do next. There was a big pile of dirty kitty litter here now. My best idea was to sweep it back into the trash can, so I started making my way back up the driveway. I didn't walk very far before something possessed me to stop and turn back around. I had this strange feeling that I was being watched. I turned my head and looked to see a light coming from my neighbor's house. And all the time that I've been doing the garbage at night, I have never seen this neighbor up that late before. I was pretty sure it was an older man. He had to have been in his late 60s, so it was kind of a surprise to see a light on in his house at this time. It was on the second floor, maybe his bedroom window. His house was on the other side of the road, and it must have been about 10 feet away from the road, so it was a good distance between me and him. I just remember feeling really freaked out that there was someone else awake and watching me. What possible reason could he have for being awake at 2 in the morning? I stood there for a moment, wondering to myself. I was just kind of staring at his window. Again, there was a good bit of distance, and I couldn't see all too clearly, but I felt my heart drop when I saw him walk away from the window. I wasn't exactly sure, but the way he moved made me think that he was standing at his window watching me. He didn't turn out the light, and I didn't see him at the window anymore. I tried telling myself that he was just an old man, and that I must have woken him up by dropping this garbage can. I got the broom, started sweeping the kitty litter back into the garbage can, and then brought it next to the road. I felt his eyes on me the whole time, even after he turned off the light. And that was the night everything changed. Every time I ever took down the garbage after that point, I noticed him watching me. I even started mixing up the times when I would bring the garbage down, and it didn't matter if it was 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. He would be there, watching. It was around this time that I also noticed that there must have been a different garbage man. The old guy used to get the garbage out of the can and throw the garbage can itself and the lid on the ground in a really sloppy way. I didn't blame him too much, but I did appreciate that this new guy was making the effort to put the lid back on the garbage can neatly. It makes my life easier to just grab them and bring them back up to the house. This was a pleasant change, but it didn't calm my nerves one bit from being watched. I started getting really creeped out. I asked my parents about what I should do, and they told me I was just being paranoid, that he was an older, retired gentleman that probably doesn't have anything better to do. If I'm being honest with you, I don't care how bored or unoccupied someone's time is. I don't think there's a person on earth that would go out of their way to watch their neighbor take out the garbage if there wasn't some kind of reason for it. This went on for the rest of the summer and into the next semester. I started getting frustrated with the whole situation. It made me really uneasy. I researched stalking laws to see if I could report him for something. I really couldn't do anything because he never actually left his property. He just always happened to be around when I started moving the garbage. Fall break came around, and I decided that I was going to make a change. I was going to watch him instead. My bedroom just happened to be on the side of the house that I could see his house from my bedroom window. I found a pair of binoculars in the basement, and after bringing the garbage down at 4 a.m. one night, I got situated next to the window and began watching this old man. He didn't turn out his bedroom light, like usual, and it seemed like he was still just sitting there. A half an hour must have gone by before I started getting really sleepy. This guy was just sitting there, watching the garbage. I was just about to go to bed when I noticed he left his bedroom. I tried paying attention to see if any of the other lights turned on in his house, but he didn't turn on any of them. I looked closely to notice any kind of changes. About 40 seconds went by, and I thought I had completely lost him. I didn't see him anywhere. I just concluded that he might be some kind of schizophrenic freak, and this was a waste of my time. Before putting the binoculars down, I looked down at the garbage pail, and I noticed that they were gone. I got really confused for a minute, and I had no idea what was going on. I waited a few more minutes to see that old man was carrying what looked like my garbage cans into his house. I waited about 40 minutes for him to go to bed. After the light in his bedroom went out, I rushed down to the garbage cans and was shocked when I noticed that they were completely empty. He had brought them back, empty. That was when it hit me. We never got a new garbage man. This guy started stealing our garbage. He must have been emptying it in his own house for whatever reason. This creeped me out so much, honestly. I had no idea what to do about it. So I started driving the trash to the dump, just to avoid having to bring the garbage cans down. After a couple weeks of doing that, I noticed that the old man seemed to be less active around his house. I don't know what he was trying to do, but it still freaks me out to this day. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before, and would let us go out there from time to time and mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and get closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans were to go shooting, drink beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us busy cleaning the cabin and moving all of our stuff inside. Around dinner time, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I would do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it too hard to see him clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I would walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make wise decisions. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting, and one guy brought a compound bow. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted, but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by, and hurriedly made my way back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what had happened, but was quickly reminded that we were not the only creatures in these woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight, I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height, with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested that he was Bigfoot. Despite my protestations, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I was not beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger, in other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I had seen this mysterious man stalking around us twice, and now he had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned to him, an owner of one of the surrounding properties had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land, and so we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for them. After a mile or so, down one of the property's main roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew that we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot, tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that someone was shooting at us. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down the side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst part was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we had smoked everything the night before. Nothing was missing but a box of 30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputies' minds that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident and moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do once or twice a year talk to my old college friend on the phone. As far as he has heard, that crazy stranger still has not been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called stranger seemed to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps far more concerning, is he still out there waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago? Sonoma County, California, is one of the most agriculturally productive areas in the entire country. It produces a huge amount of hops, grapes, prunes, apples, dairy, and poultry products every single year. This is down to the vast swaths of fertile land, in addition to the abundance of high-quality irrigation water. In addition to the vineyards and wineries that call Sonoma home, one might mistake the county for being a little slice of paradise. But during the early 1970s, a series of horrifying events in the hills around Sonoma's largest city, Santa Rosa, would make this heavenly place seem more like a circle of hell. On February 4th, 1972, two middle school friends were returning from a visit to the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. Maureen Louise Sterling and Yvonne Lisa Weber, both 12 years old, were last seen around 9 p.m. hitchhiking on Guerneville Road, northwest of Santa Rosa. Neither of the girls arrived home that night. Their parents begged local authorities to find their girls, and find them they did. Their bodies were found December 28th, just a few miles north of Franz Valley Road. A single earring, orange beads, and a 14-karat gold necklace with a cross were found at the scene. The cause of death could not be determined from the skeletal remains. Then, just a month later, 19-year-old art student Kim Wendy Allen was given a ride by two men on the evening of March 4th, 1972. They last saw her at approximately 5:20 p.m., hitchhiking to school and carrying a large wooden soy barrel with red Chinese characters on it. Her body was found the following day in an embankment in a creek bed. The two men who gave her a ride, one of whom was given and passed a polygraph test, were ruled out as suspects. This pattern of hitchhiker murders was repeated over and over again as the years went by, but only a handful had a modus operandi that matched the previous murders. One in particular had an extremely disturbing additional detail that may shed some light on who the murderer or murderers were. Carolyn Nadine Davis, 14 years old, ran away from her home outside Anderson in Shasta County on February 6, 1973, but disappeared July 15th after being dropped off by her grandmother at the Garberville post office. She was last seen hitchhiking that afternoon near the highway in Garberville. Her body was discovered on July 31st, just meters from where the remains of Sterling and Weber had been recovered 7 months prior. However, this time, the cause of death could be determined, and coroners stated that it was an obvious cause of strychnine poisoning. 10 to 14 days before the body was discovered. A witchcraft symbol meaning carrier of spirits was found by her body. As was previously mentioned, an additional 8 unsolved murders of female victims have been linked to the unknown murderer. Yet not a single conviction has been handed down in connection with any of them. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't a few prevailing theories on the murderer's true identity. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr., the Hillside Stranglers of Los Angeles, were seriously considered as suspects at one point. The Hillside Strangler murders began with the deaths of 3 sex workers who were found strangled and dumped naked on hillsides northeast of Los Angeles between October and early November 1977. It was not until the deaths of 5 young women who were not sex workers, but girls who had been abducted from middle-class neighborhoods, that the media attention and subsequent Hillside Strangler moniker came to prominence. However, there was insufficient evidence to link either Bianchi or Buono to the Sonoma County murders. So we must look elsewhere for conclusive proof. Another suspect in the case was Frederick Manali, a 41-year-old Santa Rosa junior college creative writing instructor. In August of 1976, Manali was involved in a fatal head-on collision on Highway 12. As CHP officers cleared the scene, they discovered something extremely disturbing. In addition to a large amount of creative writing work, police discovered that the instructor cultivated another form of creativity, drawing. But these weren't still life or landscape drawings. They were scenes depicting sadomasochistic acts committed on a young woman. Investigators were easily able to identify the woman in question from the quality of the sketches. It was Kim Wendy Allen, the second victim in the series of murders. Yet, despite searches of Manali's home, investigators were unable to find a credible link between the sketches and murders themselves. Another suspect in the case was none other than the subject of a recent Netflix-made movie, Ted Bundy. After the prolific murderer's capture for similar crimes in Washington, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, Ted Bundy was heavily suspected as the Sonoma County hitchhiker killer. The links between the naked bodies of the Sonoma victims and the extreme venereal nature of Bundy's crimes were obvious. It turned out that Bundy had indeed spent time in the neighboring Marin County, but was ruled out by a Sonoma County detective in the 1970s, and again in 1989. This was down to detailed credit card records that reveal Bundy was all the way up the coast in Washington state on the dates of some of the disappearances. An additional suspect in the murders is another famous name, the Zodiac Killer. Investigators were forced to consider the Zodiac Killer as a possible perpetrator due to similarities between an unknown symbol on his January 29, 1974 exorcist letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, in which he claims 37 victims, and the Chinese characters on the missing soy barrel carried by Kim Allen. Also, the Zodiac had written a letter delivered to the San Francisco Chronicle on November 9, 1969. In it, he stated an intention to vary his modus operandi in an attempt to confuse detectives and thus evade capture. I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, plus a few fake accidents, etc. Naturally, the consideration of the Zodiac Killer leads us to one Arthur Lee Allen. Allen owned a mobile home at Sunset Trailer Park in Santa Rosa at the time of the murders. He had also been fired from his Valley Springs elementary school teaching position Allen was arrested on September 27, 1974 by the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office in an unrelated case involving a young boy. He pleaded guilty on March 14, 1975, and was imprisoned at Atascadero State Hospital until late 1977. This would indeed match the time period for some of the murders. What's more, Robert Graysmith, in his book Zodiac Unmasked, claims that a Sonoma County sheriff revealed that chipmunk hairs were found on all of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker victims, and that Allen had been collecting and studying the same species. It would be possible that, since the bodies were dumped outdoors, that a few chipmunk hairs might be present on one or two of them, but all of them seems like far more than just a coincidence. Allen was the main suspect in the Zodiac case for more than 30 years, until his DNA was compared to a partial DNA profile obtained from saliva recovered on the underside of a postage stamp and envelopes from verified Zodiac letters. Results were a conclusive non-match. Fingerprints and blood recovered from the taxicab of Zodiac murder victim Paul Stein, a writer's palm print found on the Zodiac letter of January 29, 1974, and handwriting examples failed to identify Allen as the Zodiac. In practice, this evidence would have exonerated Allen should he have ever stood trial for the charges. So we are essentially forced to look elsewhere for clues to the murderer's identity. But given that almost 50 years later, each murder remains distinctly clear, just who was murdering hitchhikers in the hills around Santa Rosa, California. This happened several years ago. I was home alone one evening when I heard a knock at the back door. This confused me as no one ever used that door. My husband and I lived in a fourplex at the time, and all of the units had a back door at the top of a narrow staircase. These doors were a little inconvenient to access, as you would have to go around the building and up the narrow stairs, as opposed to the wider main entrance at the front. It didn't make sense to use the back entrance, and I couldn't think of anyone who would go to that door to visit. As I approached the back door, I saw two tall men in the window, standing at the door. A chill went down my spine. I did not feel safe opening the door, so I called out, "Hello?" One of the men tapped on the window. "Yes, hello. May we come in? We are with Bresnan." At the time, my husband and I had Bresnan for cable, but did not have any issues with it. I replied, "We're not having any issues with Bresnan. Is there a problem?" "Ma'am," the man said, "can we come in? We're servicing the area and it's important we look at your cable." I shook my head. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, "so there's no need to stop by." "Ma'am, we are visiting every resident. Let us in so we can do our job." I noticed the man grab the doorknob and try to open the locked door. I slowly grabbed a knife from our knife block and held it at my chest. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, trying not to convey shakiness of my voice. "So you don't need to be here." The two figures appeared to shuffle and then straighten. "Ma'am, let us in. We're on a deadline and need to do our job." I glanced at the clock, gauging when my husband would arrive home from work. I gripped the knife tighter. "Ma'am? Ma'am?" I saw him try the doorknob again. I closed my eyes and felt overwhelming gratitude of always locking my doors. Just then, a thought came to the forefront of my mind. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Can I please get your names and badge numbers? I can give your supervisor a call to let them know our cable's fine." I heard another shuffle and one of the men replied, "No need to, ma'am. We're sorry we wasted your time." With that, both of the men exited the staircase and disappeared into the night. Shaken up, I held the knife tight and tried to get my bearings. I remember making a mental note to call the cable company or the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold my phone. With the knife still grasped to my chest and the phone falling out of my other hand, I sank to the floor and cried. When my husband returned home, I told him what had happened. I was still very shaken up and had started crying again after he came home. He immediately called the Bresnan Cable Company and spoke to a representative who informed us that no one from their company was out on assignment in our area. The next day, we asked our neighbors if they had a visit from the company. No one had. This happened to me and my friend Anna when we were just kids, around 10 or 11 years old. I used to live in a very quiet small town, in a house right in the middle of a purely residential neighborhood. A lot of kids from my school used to live near me as well. When I was young, I was a pretty well-behaved kid. Some of my friends, though, were mischievous. Anna herself was a little punky. She liked to explore everywhere and would often go against what our parents told us. This one afternoon, Anna came to my house after school to play. Since my neighborhood was surrounded by beautiful trees and the day was warm, we set out to walk and play. It was a little bit before sundown, so maybe 5 p.m., when we spotted a cottage. We got to it and played around it for a while, until Anna spotted something right beside us, a huge, spotty Dalmatian. The dog was inside a metal-fenced backyard, belonging to the house right next to this cottage. We marveled at the dog's gracefulness and came close to it, petting it through the fence. It was friendly enough and let us play with it for a while. Suddenly, another dog came along. This time an equally large German Shepherd. This one, though, didn't seem as friendly and kept its guard up, but still let us pet it. We giggled and had fun with the dogs for a while. Nobody came out from the house their owners lived in, which was seemingly empty. From our perspective, it looked like no one was home, since the windows were shut. This house had a large yard, with some toys and a playground, indicating a family with kids lived there. I generally had a pretty good idea of who my neighbors were, but I did not know the residents of this specific house. Everything was fine, until Anna had the brilliantly stupid idea of jumping the fence in order to properly play with the dogs. Literally trespassing. I immediately protested this idea with all the reasoning of a non-confrontational child. I argued that we could get caught, go to jail, get hurt, etc. Anna, though, wasn't having any of it, and made up her mind to hop the fence. I said I would help, but would not join her, and would wait for her outside where I was. Anna was a tiny, skinny kid, and on this day she was wearing sneakers and jeans. So, against my will, I helped her up. She put her foot in a kind of step in the middle of the fence and got to the top. This fence was pointy, so Anna had to hover above the spikes in order to not hurt herself. As soon as she got steady, the worst possible thing happened. The German Shepherd started barking viciously and bit her right foot, the one that was inside the fence. Anna started screaming in pain. It took a beat to understand what was happening, because we didn't anticipate that this could even happen. I remember vividly feeling horrified not only because of the sudden loud barking, but because of the blood pouring down my friend's leg right in front of me. It took me only a couple of seconds to realize all of this, but then I immediately sprang into action, trying to pull Anna back from the top of the fence. She was crying and screaming like never before. The sounds were bone-chilling and filled with pure panic. She kept howling and saying she couldn't move and would be stuck there forever. I was terrified myself, but I knew something even worse could happen if she stayed up there for a minute longer. I couldn't get too close to the fence because now both of the dogs turned feral, as they would. Both were clearly security dogs, but we obviously did not realize it at the time. I was in so much panic that I started crying really hard while thinking of what I could possibly do to help. I got a little bit to Anna's side and tried to pull her back. That was when she bumped into the spike and ripped the inside of her jeans, by her upper thigh. Anna cried even louder. After minutes of me trying to pull her and the dogs trying to attack, she managed to throw herself onto the sidewalk safely. We hugged each other, crying and trembling. That was when I realized her shoe had fallen inside the fence, right where the dogs were still barking and stamping on. Still really shaken up, we looked around to see if there was anyone that could help us, but we were completely alone. I'll never forget that dreadful, lonely feeling. Anna's foot was bleeding quite a lot, and she kept saying how much it hurt. I asked her if she was okay with me going back to the house to call my mom, but she didn't want to be alone, nor to tell any adults what happened, in fear of a scolding. I was really frustrated and scared, but still tried to keep calm and resolve the situation. In my child mind, we couldn't leave her shoe behind, since it could be found and maybe traced back to us somehow, as if this was some kind of CSI situation. I then tried to get the shoe, but the dogs were still perceiving us as threats, even after getting off their fence. I tried throwing rocks at the back of the yard to attract their attention and make them retreat from the front gate. At first, this did nothing, but eventually they backed off. I grabbed a twig and fished out her bloody shoe from inside the gate. Hurt, crying, and shaking, we came back to my house. Luckily for Anna, my bedroom was on the ground floor and had a big window I used to climb through instead of using the back door. I smuggled her through the window and did my best to clean up the injury in secret. I don't recall exactly how bad it was, but I think the sudden anger of the attack and the sight of the blood scared us more than anything. I still made her promise she would tell her parents and take a rabies shot, since it was something I had already gone through a few years before and knew to be important. After she left, I felt so bad that I had to tell my mom. She was really worried and upset, revealing that what we did put our lives in danger, and that the house actually belonged to another kid that went to my school. That made me feel even worse. What if the kid somehow found out and told everyone? It didn't make sense, of course, but I was very shaken up. Thankfully, I was physically unharmed, and Anna recovered just fine. Nowadays, I know that what we did was pretty stupid, but back then it didn't seem like it would be such a scare, or even dangerous. All we wanted to do was play with the dogs. We did learn our lesson, though, and never hopped any fences or pet unknown animals ever again. My mom's dog, Punky, was a very sweet, loving dog. She was an ESA dog, but trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I had never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she lived. She never growled or nipped anyone, and she had no sense of smell, so she loved all animals and people. A real gentle giant among our little terriers at 60 pounds. What I'm getting at here was that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only saw it once. I, 11 at the time, was at home with my siblings. My then stepdad is at work, and my mom ran up to the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. It was only about a mile or two away from us. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods on a dead-end road at the time, and you had to really make an effort to get down our road, find our house, navigate down our rickety driveway, and find the door. I'm sitting at the computer, having a grand time watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden all of our dogs, 2 Boston Terriers and 1 Chihuahua, perk up, bark a few times, and start investigating down the hall. My siblings were napping in the bedroom at the end of the hall at the time, so I figured they just stirred and scared the dogs. But then Punky sits up suddenly, stands up on the couch, and puffs her chest out. Her ears are perked up, her fur standing on end, and then she barks. Loudly. I mean, the bark booms through the living room and echoes around. And all of a sudden she lunges off the couch and goes tearing down the hallway. I'm already on edge because I don't think I've ever heard her bark. Ever. She's a Basenji mix, so her bark is more of a baying sound. But this was a big, loud, alert bark. I stand up and go to look down the hallway, ready to fight off what I'm assuming is a shadow monster, based on how the dogs are acting. But then I hear it. Knock, knock, knock. We didn't get visitors because of how weird our house was location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The only people who showed up were family, and they didn't knock. So I slowly walked towards the door. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky. And I felt better with our 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were all the size of New York City sewer rats. I opened the door just a bit, and standing on our porch is the sketchiest man I think I've ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. He was really thin, taller man with dark hair and a sunken face, bags under his eyes, and this half-managed hair, sort of like he just gave it a quick brush and then figured it was good enough. Everything about him seemed just a little too thin, a little too shallow, and his clothes were all off too. They were nice, but fake nice, you know? Like a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and new jeans. But he had what looked like a suit jacket on. All his clothes were dark, too, despite the fact that it was summer in Texas, and the weather was definitely into the 100s that day. He also had this plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like the label had been covered up and taped over. I stare up at him in confusion because I definitely don't know this man, and I ask what he wants. He smiles at me in this way that's way too fake, like this exaggerated and forced grin. And he spoke in the same voice retail workers do. "Hey there, kiddo. I'm trying to sell this here carpet cleaner." And he shakes the bottle at me. "Mind if I come in to show you how good it works?" Alarms are going off in my head because he just seemed so off. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact that he didn't ask if my parents were home is unnerving, because he probably knew they weren't, and that's why he was here in the first place. I should have told him to get off our property, that I'd have to go get my mom, something except what I did say. But I didn't. Instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, we don't have carpet." "Well, it works on other things." He took a big step towards the door and shook the bottle at me. I start to freak out and think to close the door. But the thing is, our front door didn't even lock. It was a small town, hard to access the home. We never needed a lock, so that's basically useless. I'm sure there's something very wrong about to happen, and I'm terrified as I think about what to do in the few seconds I think I have before it does happen. When all of a sudden, I hear it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared and snarling, like she was feral. She had slobber just dripping from her mouth, her ears were down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy hears it too, and as I look towards Punky, she tries to lunge past me, and I just barely catch her with my leg as she tries her hardest to duck past me and attack this guy. He freaks out and runs off the porch without another word, booking it down the driveway as I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs, and they start chasing him. Our small dogs chase him down the driveway and stop about halfway, barking and jumping about. But Punky stops just on the porch and watches him with her ears perked, just staring in the distance until he disappears. I swear I saw someone join up with him running when he got onto the road. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. No barking or growling, just laying around, mouth and throat covered in slobber still. I realized my siblings are still down the hall and run to check on them. And when I get to the bedroom, my siblings were still sleeping soundly, but the bedroom window was wide open, the curtains pushed all to one side, and the items on the dresser in front of the window all shoved around. Someone had tried to climb through the window. No doubt in my mind about it. From what I can gather, the bedroom window was visible from the couch where Punky was sleeping. So I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky went after them and scared them off. And the man at the door was meant to distract me. They definitely didn't expect Punky, a bigger dog, because most of the time she was with my mom inside, while our small dogs were the ones that saw public eye more often. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house, and on our way there we saw the men walking up someone else's driveway. Men, plural, because we watched a second one split off to wait by the road. The following events took place in June 2022. My passion is in wild foods. I'm no stranger to working out in the bush for a living. Prior to this, I was building mountain bike trails for my friend's company he owned, and was a tree planter. I realized mountain biking, while fun, is not something I can use to get ahead in the world. Tree planting, while lucrative, is probably the most miserable I have ever been in the workforce. Good parties, though. It's basically sacrificing all comfort and volunteering yourself for hardship and misery, so you can earn a bunch of money quickly and have a rave in the woods every 3 days. I always picked mushrooms and foraged for fun. But once I found out I could monetize my passion, that it's in fact a pretty big industry, and can be just as lucrative, if not more so, than planting, I was head over heels. Granted, you need to know what you are doing and what to look for and where, but you can make a killing if you do. Morels are a very lucrative and sought-after wild mushroom that rely almost entirely on wildfires to produce fruiting bodies. The carbon from a wildfire spikes the pH of the soil in such a way that it is the ample substrate to produce, and the connection between the mycelium and the relationship with the tree roots they depend on becomes disrupted. So they desperately flourish, producing as many morel mushrooms as possible, to spread as many spores as possible to reestablish these connections. In turn, they also cleanse the soil and allow the forest to regenerate. Sometimes I find a patch so juicy my jaw just drops, and I cannot even believe what I have stumbled across. That being said, it's a dangerous industry. Every picker I have met has some sort of harrowing tale of survival. Each year, pickers go missing, either to be found as a corpse or never seen again. Being that far out in the wilderness is inherently dangerous. One time I slipped and almost impaled my chest on my knife. I'd have been so screwed. Even just rolling an ankle that far from a road or a hospital carries its own risks. I have almost died alone in the woods more times than I'd like to admit, and this tale is just one of those times. It was a beautiful bluebird day to be out picking. I was deep in the woods off a logging road, inside the Okanagan Indian Band. I must have hiked close to 2 kilometers up the mountain across a cut block, and far into the woods. I kept finding clusters, nothing too special, I had come across one hillside that was very steep, but was loaded with some big honkers. The top of the ridgeline had various clusters all over it. I had about 25 pounds stuffed into buckets which I had propped up next to a decaying log so they wouldn't tip over. I was taking a break while also scouting the area to see if any more were around. I had pretty much depleted the area on top of the ridgeline, and beyond that was too dry for anything to grow. I was scanning around, hoping I could find one more cluster. Generally, mushrooms will cluster near a patch. I knew it was around, in the general vicinity. My eyes turned back to the direction I came from. There was a really steep hill that plateaued out into another ridgeline, but just below this hill, the ground was littered with burnt pine cones. Then it dawned on me. I am picking in cedar and birch. There are no pine cones to be had up in here. Holy crap. Those aren't pine cones, I exclaimed to myself in astonishing wonder. I panicked with excitement. Normally I'd have dropped a waypoint to my buckets on my GPS, but if my eyes didn't deceive me, I somehow walked right past the biggest patch of morels I'd ever seen in my life. I scrambled down that steep hill as fast as I could, and sure enough, blending into the black soil and singed cedar leaves was an overwhelming surplus of morels. Most of these were young baby mushrooms. If I had my wits about me, I would have marked this entire area on my GPS also, as that patch would be producing for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Instead, I hungrily and greedily scrambled across the forest floor on my hands and knees, filling my planting bags, my t-shirt, baskets, and everything I could use to store them. There were so many. I was financially struggling and looking so hard that I was ready to cry at the blessing nature had bestowed upon me. I stood up for a second, drenched in sweat. I caught a bad whiff of something in the air. Disgusting, I thought to myself. As soon as I get to camp and cash out, I'm heading to town and washing these nasty nose piercings. Gonna get some real food and a nice clean shower, I thought to myself. I was driven. Shortly after, I thought I heard sticks snapping. I froze, called out to the wind, scanning my surroundings. A woodpecker near me started pecking a tree. Dang bird, I said to myself as I resumed working. Little did I know, I was being watched this entire time. I had pretty much filled everything I could carry mushrooms in up to the brim, and couldn't pick any more. I resolved to mark this on my GPS, cash out at the nearest buyer station, and head back up and pick until dusk. Suddenly, without warning, I heard a very loud and hollow thud, followed by another, and another. I looked back to the source, and it was my mushroom bucket tumbling all the way down the hill, spewing mushrooms in every direction like Sonic the Hedgehog when he loses his rings. A very strong gust of wind came, and simultaneously my other bucket followed suit. This was infuriating. I threw a hissy fit and started screaming at my buckets as loud as I could as they tumbled. Screaming expletives, slurs, and curse words at the winds, assuming it was a breeze that knocked them over. When I got my composure back, I heard a very loud snap and a loud huff. Right at the top of the ridgeline was a black bear staring me down. I have encountered many a bear with only a few close encounters. The moment I saw this bear, I knew something was off. It was a juvenile, big, yet scrawny. It was bobbing its head up and down and huffing. Its fur was standing on end, and it was staring right at me. It looked agitated. It took a few steps towards me, and I froze. I knew I had to stay calm. No point in running from a bear. Side note, as I was leaving my car that morning and looking for my bear spray, it was nowhere to be found. I could see it clearly in my mind's eye right next to my bed in my tent. Screw it, it's not like I'm gonna need it, I said to myself. I also had an X-Acto knife and a buck knife, both of which were black-colored and got lost as soon as I set them down in the woods. They blended in seamlessly into the black ground. I was vulnerable, sitting duck with only my limbs to defend myself. Crap was the only thing that went through my mind at first. It started slowly coming towards me. Our eyes were locked together. I started to realize the severity of the situation. I reached for my spray and it wasn't there. I remembered that if a black bear attacks you, you must fight back. Unlike grizzlies, black bears will eat you alive if they attack you. Bears do not kill their prey. They just eat it. Grizzlies will attack if they see you as a threat, and playing dead does in fact work for them. Not black bears. Though rare, black bear attacks on average are more fatal than grizzly attacks. Fun fact. All of these thoughts came rushing through my head so fast I could barely process them. I was still frozen as this bear slowly crept down the long hill toward me, grumbling and growling. To say I felt vulnerable and helpless is an understatement. I realized I was looking this bear directly in the eyes, and even though it was far away, it is not something you should ever do. I remember my crew boss in tree planting describing black bears as big raccoons that are easily startled, to make lots of noise, get big and try to scare it off. I unclipped the planting bags I was using to store mushrooms on my hips, lifted them over my head to augment my size, and gave a long shout as loud as I could. The bear froze and growled, completely unfazed by this. I stomped the ground and gave a couple of short shouts like a dog would bark. Hey! Hey! As soon as I screamed this at the top of my lungs, it erupted into full-blown charge straight at me. Supposedly, the top speed of a bear is 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. It's astounding how explosively fast they reach that top speed. I didn't even have time to flinch before it had cleared all that ground and was upon me. I kept my size augmented with my planting bags and was screaming bloody murder. Literally screaming so loud I tasted blood. Standing my ground, just full-blown panic screaming. This bear was stopped 10 feet away from me, snarling, drooling, snapping its jaws and swiping at me. The bear stopped, and I backed up maybe 6 feet before it lunged at me again. I stayed put, screaming at it. The bear got up on its hind legs, staring down at me, and let off a roar. As it came back down on its fours, it snapped its teeth once more and took a swipe at me with its claws. It looked like it was going to pounce and eat me the next move it made. Without even thinking of it, I took a gamble. I leered at it screaming and kicked a pile of dirt and ash directly into its face and open mouth. This, in hindsight, was very foolish. 9 out of 10 times, it would have just pissed it off. But it worked. The bear coughed and huffed, looking at me and growled before running back up to the ridgeline. It spun around and looked like it was going to charge again, but I raised my bags higher above my head and let out the most desperate cries imaginable, screaming beyond bloody murder. The bear finally got on top of the ridgeline, and I started backing out away from it in the direction I came from initially. It was now following me, with eyes on me. The only thing separating us being the long, steep hill between ridgelines that was getting longer the further I went. This bear was stalking me as I literally sidestepped in a crab walk, screaming as loud as I could at it, screaming every curse word in the book, until my throat was completely raw. I realized I was still locked in direct eye contact with it and instantly felt like an idiot. I jumped up and down, screaming as loud as I could. It huffed and went out of sight. As this bear disappeared behind the ridgeline, I noticed I didn't even have time to realize how scared I actually was. I felt dizzy. My heart was beating out of its chest, and sweat was literally pouring off my body. Is it gone? I thought to myself. No, it wasn't. It disappeared out of sight and got behind me in the direction I was moving in. I heard brush snapping as it reappeared on top of the ridgeline further down, waiting for me to get closer. "Piss off!" I shouted, augmenting my size again, making all the ruckus I could. It charged again down the hill at me. Good thing I went to the bathroom in the woods before this happened. Otherwise, I would have filled my trousers and seasoned myself. This time it charged slightly off to the side of me and blew right past me. Down the hill and out of sight again. I took this opportunity to run in the direction I came from. This was stupid. The sound of my fleeing must have brought it back, because the next thing you know, I was staring down at it from the ridgeline I was at. Again, I augmented my size and slowly started backing away. This thing ran up onto the ridgeline I was at, paused, then scrambled back up the hill and resumed stalking me from on top of the upper ridgeline again. It ran farther down and waited. I was certain I was going to die that day. I knew for a fact that I was being hunted. This bear was stalking me and closing a circle around me, so it could pounce when it knew I wasn't looking at it. I'm not a religious man, but found myself begging to God to save me, and begging for forgiveness. It all felt hopeless and in vain. I proceeded along with my exit strategy, as this thing went out of sight again. Cautiously, I started walking faster, until I came around the bend, and this bear was right in my path, staring me down, and slowly approaching me, snarling and huffing. I knew I was helpless, and so did this bear. I screamed at it, cursing, and started walking carefully up the hill it descended down on me from prior. It approached me again, and I kicked more dirt at it from a distance that would never reach it. This bear was hesitant. I don't think it really knew what to do, as it probably never encountered a human, and I was tall, with the upper ground now. I slipped walking backward up this steep hill, and its interest definitely peaked again. The bear resumed its approach. I had like 25 to 30 pounds of mushrooms in these planting bags I had over my head, and I could barely hold my arms up anymore, so I chucked them down the hill at this thing. The bear scrambled towards this scattered mess of mushrooms, sniffed them, bit one, spat it out and looked at me again. I continued with my exit strategy as it scrambled up the hill, so it was level with me. It let out a strange noise as I was shouting once again for it to screw off. It continued approaching. I stopped. Then the bear stopped. This happened frequently, and each time the bear stopped, I would resume, and shortly after, it would continue stalking me. It appeared to lose interest in me and again ran out of sight. I stood there petrified for a bit, until it seemed like it had finally left me alone. At this point, I started hiking with haste in the direction I was retreating in, frequently stopping to listen and check my surroundings. Just before I broke out of the woods into the cut block, I caught another nasty whiff of something. I knew the bear was around. I could smell it. These creatures roll in carcasses, feces, and muck. Most times you can smell a bear before you see it. I couldn't see anything. That is until I noticed it goalposted between two trees, right next to me, still checking me out. I started screaming, every expletive in the book until it felt like my voice was breaking. At this point, I had finally made it to the cut block I hiked in from. I continued backing away. The bear continued approaching. It stopped, however. It was just checking me out from the tree line now, and not approaching any further. I was now in a wide-open exposed spot where I could see my surroundings without any obstructions. The direction I was fleeing revealed the faint neon colors of the tents back at Jane's camp. Meanwhile, back at Jane's camp, an old man named Chuck, bless his soul, was eating a can of beans and smoking a joint and heard me screaming for a while. He reluctantly decided someone had injured themselves in the bush and went to go investigate. I reached the opposite end of the cut block, and the bear looked like it was just a distant furball now. As I was getting closer to the camp, I saw Chuck walking up the hill, joint in hand, asking me if everything was all right. I was so rattled that I frantically explained everything I just went through, while hyperventilating and broke down crying in front of this man. Calmly, he extended his joint to me.
Here, man. Take some. You really need it right now.
A wave of calm washed over me. He offered me water. We walked down the hill to a spring coming out of the mountain, and I splashed water on my face. I felt safe. I felt like the situation was over. I got my bearings again, and started breaking down that I worked almost 9 hours and lost all of my mushrooms. Bless this man, as his response was,
"Oh, buddy, you lost all of it? Come on, let's go get him."
After a lot of back and forth, he convinced me of things I should have done to avoid that situation altogether, and convinced me of strength in numbers. I explained I had no waypoint on my GPS, and that it would be a mission. He asked if I could trace my steps and find the area again.
"Yeah, I think so,"
I replied.
"Let's go then, come on, before it gets dark."
"What about the bear?"
"What bear?"
I looked back and the bear was gone. He had bear spray too, so we started booting back up the mountain. It was a wild goose chase, but 2.5 hours of hiking later, as we were giving up and the sun was setting, I found them. We hastily packed these mushrooms out of the woods and got back to camp where I cashed out. I thanked Chuck profusely. What a guy. He didn't even ask for a cut for helping me. Now, I was debating even including this information, but I feel it's somehow important. That year, I was in a deep depression, where I was strongly considering ending it all. This experience was a spiritual one, and the spiritual revelation that came from all of this was, I am going to freaking Denny's. I almost died a slow, painful, agonizing death in the woods by myself, and my last meal would have been Vector cereal with no milk. I bought 3 steaks and 4 appetizers. I realized if I ever leave this world, I am not leaving willingly. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? On the 24th of November, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a gentleman in his mid-40s walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter at Portland International Airport in Oregon. He was a quiet, unassuming man in dark sunglasses, carrying a black briefcase and wearing a black business suit with a white shirt. As he used cash to purchase a one-way ticket to nearby Seattle, he told the clerk behind the counter that his name was Dan Cooper. Shortly after, Cooper boarded the waiting Boeing 727 and took a seat in the rear of the passenger cabin before ordering a bourbon and soda. The sparsely occupied aircraft took off on schedule at 2:50 p.m. that afternoon for the short, 30-minute flight into Washington. Once the flight had reached altitude, flight attendant Florence Schaffner began to walk up and down the aisle, taking drink orders from the passengers. When she reached the row where Dan Cooper was sat and asked him for his order, he simply handed her a note. Miss Schaffner opened it up and gasped when she saw what was written. Written with a felt-tip pen in neat, printed capital letters were just 4 words. I have a bomb. Cooper then invited Florence Schaffner to take a seat next to him, only it wasn't so much an invitation as an order. According to later statements, Cooper then showed the terrified flight attendant exactly what was in his briefcase. She saw 8 large cylinders linked to a small circular battery unit with red insulation wire. Schaffner had never seen an explosive device before, but the one she saw that afternoon was very, very convincing. Cooper then leaned into her ear before whispering his demands. $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle, one that was ready to refuel the aircraft once it had landed. Schaffner promptly walked down the aircraft's aisle to the cockpit, relayed Cooper's demands to the pilot, and assuring him that she had seen the explosive device that he was threatening them with. Captain William Scott, the aircraft's pilot, quickly contacted Seattle Airport, informing them of the grave situation on board. Not wishing to cause a panic, the pilot passed a message over the intercom to the passengers on board, telling them that their arrival at the Seattle airport would be slightly delayed due to minor technical difficulties. On its arrival in Seattle airspace, the aircraft entered a holding pattern, circling the area to ensure that local authorities had time to fully assemble the money and parachutes that Cooper had demanded. Meanwhile, the president of the airline in question actually relented to Cooper's demands, personally authorizing the withdrawal of the full $200,000 from company accounts, and passing along instructions that all company employees were to fully comply with the hijacker to preserve human life. A remarkable aspect of the hijacking was Cooper's behavior during the ordeal. Many aircraft hijackings during that period were hallmarked by the cruelty and political extremism of the perpetrators, such as the German Communist Red Army faction. But flight attendant Florence Schaffner later described Cooper as being well-spoken, calm, and polite, going so far as paying for his drinks and offering to provide food for the flight attendants when the plane landed in Seattle. At no point did Cooper relate any kind of political motive for the hijacking, and in fact did not communicate any motive for his actions whatsoever. We can only assume that Cooper was a criminal who merely sought personal gain, but one that showed an unusual amount of compassion and empathy for those involved in the hijacking. At 5:24 p.m., FBI agents on the ground at Seattle Airport, who had gathered Cooper's money from a few different local banks, relayed a message to the pilot that the aircraft was cleared to land. Once it had landed, Cooper instructed the pilot to taxi the plane to a well-lit area off the runway, before telling the flight attendants to shut off all the window shades on board, to ensure that FBI snipers would be unable to get a clear shot on him. This is one of the first clues we get to just how much thought and planning Cooper had put into the whole operation. Shortly afterward, Northwest Orient Airlines ops manager approached the aircraft in civilian clothing, delivering a set of backpacks that were stuffed with cash to one of the flight attendants via the plane's rear staircase. Once Cooper was happy that the delivery was sufficient, he told all passengers and a handful of the flight crew to disembark, leaving only a skeleton crew to fly him out of there. It was during the refueling of the aircraft that Cooper informed them of their new course. They would be flying southeast towards Mexico City. But Cooper didn't only give them a new direction. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the aircraft's functionality, instructing them exactly how he wished the pilot to fly the plane, such as the speed and altitude he wanted them to fly at, even down to the angle at which he wanted the wing flaps to be deployed. He also instructed the pilot to ensure that the cabin remain unpressurized, telling him to leave the rear doors of the aircraft open when the plane took off again. An official from the Federal Aviation Administration requested a face-to-face meeting with Cooper, informing him that takeoff would be extremely unsafe given some of the conditions he had requested. It was a bluff. He was counting on Cooper knowing next to nothing about aviation. But Cooper knew far more than anyone had predicted, and argued in return that he would only lower the stairs once the plane was in the air. As previously mentioned, it seems Cooper had planned and researched the operation in extreme forensic detail in the months, or possibly years, leading up to the incident, and came armed with a frightening amount of knowledge surrounding civilian aviation. There was, however, one thing that Cooper apparently did not have knowledge of. He seemed to have expected the aircraft to be able to make one solid flight down to Mexico City, when in fact, it only had a maximum range of about 1,000 miles. The co-pilot informed Cooper that they would have to make a refueling stop at Reno Airport down in Nevada. Cooper agreed, but seemed bizarrely unconcerned by such a detail. About 2 hours after they had originally landed, the hijacked aircraft prepared to take off again, with just 5 people on board. 4 crew members and the hijacker himself. However, at this stage, the plane was being tailed by 2 F-106 fighter aircrafts that had scrambled from the nearby McChord Air Force Base, one above and one below the hijacked plane, so that Cooper would be unable to see them. After the plane took off, Cooper ordered the entire flight crew into the cockpit, leaving him alone in the cabin. One was later noted to have said that they had seen Cooper tying something around his waist before he began to lower to the rear staircase. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the aircraft's rear staircase was still lowered when the pilots landed the plane at Reno Airport. A large number of waiting FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and local Reno PD began to surround the jet, and quickly boarded to take Cooper into custody before he had a chance to get airborne again, and escaped to Mexico. But as they completed a thorough search of the aircraft, they discovered that Cooper was nowhere to be found. All that remained of the man was his black clip-on tie, his tie clip, and 2 of the 4 parachutes he had requested as part of his demands. The only possible conclusion to be drawn was that, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had jumped out of the plane. What followed was arguably the most extensive and intensive search and recovery operation in U.S. history. A series of composite sketches was developed, with local police and FBI agents immediately seeking to question around 800 possible suspects. All but 20 or so of these were quickly eliminated from the investigation. One of these suspects was an Oregon man by the name of D.B. Cooper, who had a relatively small criminal history. He too was ruled out of the investigation, as just one of the theories was that it was highly unlikely that the hijacker would have used his actual birth name to pull off such a daring heist. But thanks to the details of his questioning being released by reporters, the name D.B. Cooper stuck in the public's consciousness. Given that Cooper was thought to have jumped out of the aircraft just 20 minutes or so after takeoff, police centered their search on a certain area of Washington, specifically the land around the Lewis River in the southwest of the state. FBI agents and sheriff's deputies from nearby counties searched large areas of the mountainous wilderness surrounding the Lewis River, on foot and by helicopter. Door-to-door searches of local farmhouses were also carried out, while search parties ran patrol boats along the river and in surrounding lakes. But no trace of Cooper, nor any of the equipment he was thought to have jumped out of the aircraft with, was ever located. The FBI then attempted to locate a trace of Cooper by releasing a list of serial numbers that were printed on the money they had given him. But this did little more than confuse the situation. In 1972, two men used counterfeit $20 bills, printed with Cooper serial numbers, to con $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter, in exchange for an interview with a man they falsely claimed was the hijacker. For all intents and purposes, the man who called himself Dan Cooper had successfully completed his criminal operation before he disappeared into thin air. No evidence of Cooper was discovered until February of 1980, when a family vacationing on the Columbia River made a miraculous discovery. As they raked over a sandy riverbank to build a campfire, they uncovered 3 packets worth of the ransom cash that was delivered to Cooper on the tarmac of Seattle Airport. The bills had suffered serious water damage over the years and were heavily deteriorated, but were soon identified as the genuine article by FBI agents. However, none of the other bills have ever turned up anywhere in the world, despite their serial numbers still being available online for public inspection. But who exactly was Dan Cooper? It might seem obvious, but his financial situation was most likely extremely desperate. Why would a man take such an enormous risk otherwise? But whether or not this was to pay medical bills, debts, or for something more material, can only be speculated on. One of the flight attendants told FBI interviewers that Cooper had been able to recognize the city of Tacoma from the air, and also noted that McChord Air Force Base was less than a half-hour's drive from Seattle Airport, something that few civilians would have been aware of at the time. This has given rise to the idea that Cooper was an Air Force veteran, or at least had a background in aviation, a theory supported by Cooper's apparently expert knowledge of the nature of aircraft. He was aware of flying techniques, engine placement, aircraft specifications, as well as local terrain. He may have also specifically selected the 727 model of aircraft, thanks to a recent innovation that allowed all 3 fuel tanks to be refilled at once. Cooper also knew that the rear staircase could be lowered during flight, a fact that was never disclosed to civilian flight crews, since there was no situation on a passenger flight that would make it necessary. He also seemed aware that its operation by a single switch in the rear of the cabin could not be overridden from the cockpit. Some of this knowledge was only known by CIA paramilitary units. So could Cooper have been former CIA? Or perhaps a rogue agent? One particularly interesting point is that Dan Cooper is a name shared by a popular Belgian comic book hero who was enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Dan Cooper took part in numerous heroic adventures, including parachuting. Yet the Dan Cooper comics were never translated into English, nor were they imported over to the United States. So there has been much speculation that the hijacker may have encountered them during a tour of duty in Europe during World War II. The comics were not sold in the US, but since some copies were translated into French, they were sold in Canada. Cooper could have well been a Canadian citizen, given that he jumped out of a plane in Washington. His escape plan could have been over the border to his native country, with the whole Mexico reference being a diversionary tactic. In line with this theory, much has been made of his specific demand for negotiable American currency, a phrase which some was determined as unlikely to be used by a U.S. citizen. Despite the fact that no dead body has ever been found, the FBI has long speculated that Cooper did not survive his jump, parachuting into the stormy Washington wilderness without the right equipment in such terrible conditions. It's unlikely he even got his chute to open, and even if Cooper was lucky enough to land safely, survival in the mountainous terrain in the onset of winter would have been all but impossible without an accomplice waiting at an agreed-upon drop zone. This would have required a perfectly timed jump, which would have required cooperation from the flight crew, and there is no evidence that Cooper requested or received any such help from the crew, or that he had any clear idea where he was when he jumped out of the plane. It was also revealed that one of the parachutes they had provided to Cooper has been a dummy, an unusable unit with an inoperative ripcord intended solely as a teaching aid, although it had clear markings identifying it to any experienced skydiver as non-functional. However, the FBI stressed that inclusion of the dummy reserve parachute, one of the 4 obtained in haste from a Seattle skydiving school, was accidental and not a deliberate attempt to kill Cooper. The search for D.B. Cooper officially ended on the 8th of July 2016. It was on this day that the FBI announced that it was ending all active investigations, telling the public that they needed to focus its investigative resources and manpower elsewhere. Local FBI field offices have stated that they will continue to accept any legitimate physical evidence related specifically to the parachutes or the ransom money that may emerge in the future. The 60-volume case file compiled over the 45-year course of the investigation will be preserved for historical purposes at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. On the FBI website, there is currently a 28-part packet full of evidence gathered over the years, and all the evidence is open to the public to read. So keep your eyes and ears open for a man with a little too much in the way of aircraft knowledge, who has a little too much money for a retiree. There's every chance that D.B. Cooper might still be out there, and it might be a listener of this very channel that finally solves the mystery of the greatest airline heist of all time. I want you to picture the middle of nowhere, rural Kentucky, an iconic country home, ranch style. The owners are wealthy. The closest neighbors live 15 entire minutes away. The closest gas station is a half an hour. Walmart, 40 minutes away. Those are the circumstances under which I was raised. Then there's me, a pretty typical 20-year-old who was born and raised in a relatively wealthy family. I was lucky enough to have been born to a father who owned a store in a mid-sized city. The city itself saw a major population growth in the 10 years after my father had purchased the store, and it produced enough income that we immediately became the 1% in the state. Probably the entire country, too. My father took the money that he made from this store and used it to purchase real estate, which produced more money. So, we kinda had buckets of money laying around. For some reason or another, my father thought the ideal life was away from civilization, which is why he built this ranch home, out in the middle of nowhere. It was always a bit of an inconvenience living life. After all the money in the world means nothing if you don't have stores to spend it at. But the older I got, the more my father educated me on finances. He also said that he didn't want us being corrupted by metropolitan living. I didn't really agree with him, but I respected him. There were many nights that I spent at the home, alone. I was always a fairly mature kid, so my parents naturally gave me a lot of responsibility. The first time I was home alone, I must have been 12 years old, and considering we had a house full of expensive weapons, alcohol, and hunting equipment, you can understand how much trust my parents really had in me. There wasn't very much in the world I wasn't prepared for, but there was one experience in particular, something that happened a few weeks ago, that I still think about all the time, sitting in my memory, haunting me. It happened one night when I was alone. My father had a busy meeting on a Saturday morning, so we got a hotel Friday night in the city with my mom. This left me alone to watch the castle by myself. Again, something I have done a million times, and never thought twice about it. I have always been interested in business ventures online. The thing I have been experimenting with that night was video marketing. I was interested in making something go viral. Over the course of a few weeks, I probably had created 6 or 7 solid viral video attempts, but only one of them accumulated any attention, and it was a measly 100,000 views. Anyway, I remember sitting in my home office working on a cat video. On the far side of my room is a window. I can see the backyard. There's a mountainous structure in our backyard. Basically, a really big rock. It's pretty tall, probably about 50 or 60 feet. And in front of it is all farmland. My father grew wheat, although he paid people to do most of the work. But here's the thing. There was a very strange shadow on the rocks. There were some lights from the electrical posts in the field, and it was as if someone was moving around them or something. This was absurd. You guys know how tall those electric posts are. The idea that someone would climb on top of one, or that there was some kind of animal or something on it, really freaks me out. But it's absurd. I really didn't want to lose electricity either, as I was really into that cat video. I looked out the window to see what was going on, and all I could see was a shadowy figure on the light post, near the light. My immediate thought was that there was some kind of freak that came out here and climbed on top of it. But I could not imagine why anyone would do that. I put my horror movie-based fear to the back of my mind and rationalized that it must have been some kind of animal that had climbed up there. Maybe a large cat? It was far away enough that I could not give you a rough size. Could have been a bear. Could have been a person. Or a cat for all I knew. I just knew something was up there. Just to be on the safe side, I grabbed a weapon and my flashlight to go check out the situation. I made my way out there slowly. I got more nervous as the moments went by. Each step seemed to bring me closer to the unknown. My fear grew with the increasing distance between me and my house. The grass outside was dry. It was warm out. I slowly got closer and closer to the pole. By the time I got close enough to see the figure up there, I noticed that it was gone. I stood there in silence for a moment, contemplating what it could have been. I looked around to see if whatever animal may have been up there had fallen. I didn't see anything in the general vicinity. I always hated leaving animals to die like that. I got down on one knee to say a prayer for whatever animal had been up there. I couldn't imagine that it didn't die, whatever it was. While I was praying, I heard a hiss behind me and felt it. Scratch. Claws dug into my back. I reacted the only way I knew how and flung my body around. I thrusted my elbow against whatever was behind me. I hit it really hard, in an almost instinctual way. I got away from it and immediately began firing my weapon in its direction. I must have gotten 5 shots off by the time I stopped and realized what I had done. I had obliterated a raccoon. It still freaked me out. The entire experience was kind of traumatic. Silly, I know. Staying home alone was never quite the same. I called my dad and told him what happened before driving myself to the hospital. I had to get a rabies shot, unfortunately, which may have been the most painful experience of my life. I discovered the next day that I had inadvertently shot 2 of the windows out of my mom's SUV. My parents made me pay for that with my own money. And no, I was not nearly as rich as them. The only money I had to my name was the money I made from my personal business ventures online. It was lame. My dad always hammered into my head that the bullets I fire are my responsibility, no matter what. It's not a bad lesson to learn. When I got out of the hospital, I went home and finished making that cat video. It only got 3,000 views. You can't win them all, I guess. But yeah, The moral of the story is that even rich people who are secluded in the middle of nowhere still have to deal with stupid stuff like this happening to them. Those dang raccoons. I have been reading a lot of stories recently about how Mother Nature is basically reclaiming the land since this whole lockdown thing went into place. In particular, one story that's come out of the UK which talks about how a giant herd of wild goats has essentially taken over a small Welsh town. It's pretty charming, detailing how these rare Kashmiri goats have seized the opportunity that's been presented by people staying indoors to roam down from the hills, to wander around neighborhoods, devouring the contents of flower boxes and front gardens alike. There are also those stories about the swans returning to the canals out in Venice Beach, but you can go read up on them yourself, as I've got a point to get onto here. So a little side note, has anyone else noticed how nice the weather has gotten since the lockdown started? It's been so frustrating, shut indoors while the weather went from gray and windy to warm and sunny in like what must have been a matter of days. In all of my life, I've honestly never seen spring slam into winter with such a dramatic transition. It's been tough on my little girl, too. She's been dying to get out to the local park to play on the jungle gyms, and telling her no, not to mention explaining why, has been harder and harder as the weeks have gone by. I can't tell her the truth, because I know it would absolutely terrify her. Breaking down that there are little creatures living inside of us, waiting to be transmitted to someone she loves, like Pap Pap or Nana, which could end their lives. How do you even say that crap to a child without them totally freaking out? So, our story starts with bird watching. I know, super boring, but try telling that to my daughter. She burned through all her DVDs and favorite YouTube channels in like a week. And despite some of them having palpable rewatch value to them, she quickly grew tired of staring at the screen for hours on end. And it got way, way worse when we started having to tell her no about going to the park. It seems like once you hold something out of reach of a kid, it's all they want from then on. The forbidden thing. Anyway, I found a happy compromise with her, in that if she stayed inside, she could look at the garden all she wanted. And the bonus was that if she stayed super still and quiet, that all kinds of birds and other critters would wander into the garden for her to look at. And you know what? It actually got kind of fun after a while. I finished an old native birds of the upper American East Coast that I'm pretty sure was my grandpa's at one point, and we got to work ticking off each one we saw, working our way through the book as common and rarely seen birds alike landed among the flower beds of our backyard. One evening, I'd swear, I saw something larger moving among the trees at the back of our yard, but I figured it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a neighbor's dog moving against their back fence, casting shadows into ours. But a few days later, I discovered it wasn't just my imagination. I was doing some laundry upstairs while my daughter busied herself with bird watching. I had ordered a cheap pair of kids' binoculars from Amazon, and those things really had paid for themselves by the evening of the day they arrived. My kid was obsessed with them. She had them practically strapped to her face for the entire day, looking at everything and anything up close and being amazed at the results. So she was only too happy to sit in front of the patio window doors and for hours checking out the wildlife at close range through her new binoculars. And thankfully, because having to keep an eye on her day in day out was meaning housework was mounting up, and at the top of the list, was laundry. So I'm working through the piles of dirty clothes, calling down to her every so often to see how she's doing, and everything seems to be going fine. Every so often, I would rush down when she claimed to have spotted a new kind of bird in our garden. Often, I would have to point out that it was one we had seen before. But once or twice, we actually locked eyes with a lesser spotted woodpecker, a bird we most definitely had not spotted before. Only when I heard her cry out, "Kitty," I figured she must have gotten bored of watching for birds. At first, I was a little worried. The last thing I wanted was for my little girl to witness a full-on bird murder in our own backyard. But I was quietly reassured by the fact that all the neighborhood cats were fat and spoiled. They wouldn't be finessing at backyard birds anytime soon. That was for certain. Suddenly, I heard a kind of thump against the window doors, like my daughter had hit her head against the glass, super hard. I called down to her not to hit the glass as it would scare all the birds away, and they might not want to visit. Her answer made me drop the laundry basket and hurtle downstairs. I didn't. It was the kitty. But that thump was loud. Bigger and louder than anything a simple house cat could make. It's so weird to tell about it now, but I distinctly remember just not thinking at all. Just sort of flying into action. And what do I see the moment I turn the corner into the TV room? I see my daughter standing at the glass door, staring an actual mountain lion in the face. The huge cat had its paw half-cocked, as if I didn't already have an idea that it was the one making that banging noise against the glass. I ran towards my little girl, with such speed and aggression that the mountain lion jumped back for a second. Danger that she seemed to be completely unaware of previously, caught up with her and hit her like a freight train. She started bawling, screaming, realizing in a white-hot moment that Kitty did not want to play. Kitty wanted to rip and tear. The kitty wasn't a kitty at all. Once it realized I had taken away its intended prey, the mountain lion took a few more swipes at the glass, and only rushed out of the backyard since I started banging pots and pans together real loud, just like my grandpa had showed me years before. I guess this was just a long-winded way of saying to keep a real close eye on the woods and green spaces when this lockdown is over. It might not be entirely safe for our kids to be playing in places that have obviously been reclaimed by wildlife, and dangerous wildlife at that. A few years back, I was really into caving. I really didn't think I would be into it when I first tried it, like I'd have considered myself mildly claustrophobic. The kind of guy who always felt a little anxious, zipping a sleeping bag up the whole way. But I don't know whether it just woke something up in me, or it was the rush of getting over a fear, or something to that effect. But I took to it like a duck to water. You're somewhere you shouldn't be, exploring parts of the world that very few people see, relying on people, truly relying on them, to ensure your safety and theirs. It's a rush, that's for certain, but it's not without its dangers. So every year, my family and a few close friends head out to a national park or something along those lines to spend some time with nature. And one particular year, I managed to convince them to go out to Mammoth Cave National Park, over in Kentucky, which is home to the more than 400 miles of passageways, making it the world's largest known cave system. The cave system is located within the Green River Valley, and its winding chambers, pools, and limestone labyrinths are equal parts beautiful and eerie. 10 different tours offer guests the opportunity to explore the decorated, historic, and dripstone areas. The cave complex is especially well known for its natural entrance and Gothic avenue, a passageway filled with historic stone monuments and signatures from 19th century visitors. So, that was just about enough history and photo ops for my mom and aunts. The river could provide hours of fishing for my dad and uncles, all while myself and my cousin could enjoy the caving there. All went well with the vacation, right up until the second to last day, when my cousin and I decided to get a little too explorative during a visit to the caves. My cousin was fairly new to caving, so for the first few days, we didn't go too deep or too far. The last thing I wanted to do was freak him out before we had even done anything worth writing home about. But as the week drew to a close, there was no way I was going home without finding something a little more extreme to traverse. So as we were heading back to civilization after an afternoon's caving, we found a slit just less than a knee-high in the rock wall of a cavern. You had to get down on your stomach to fit into such a tight squeeze, but if you did, it led to a small crawl space that cut through the entire rock. After a few meters, I noticed that quartz was growing on the passageway's ceiling, and in the light of our headlamps, they glittered in a way that I can't even really describe in words. I mean, it's like something out of a fairy tale, a still from one of those weirder Jim Henson movies. It's just magical. So, we entered one at a time, given that the tunnel was only wide enough for one person. The old claustrophobic me would have thought this place was a living nightmare. For real, I would have had a straight-up panic attack, and probably died of a heart attack before deprivation ever set in. Every single time you took a breath in some places, you would feel the ceiling of the tunnel on your back. It was that narrow, but the new me just found it thrilling. Once you get it into your head that these things can't just up and collapse on you, you get this feeling of calm, and then one of exhilaration when you realized you were conquering your fears and going places other men dared to tread. The deeper inside the tunnel we went, the more incredible the scenery became. It was like a whole other tiny world tucked away with the solid rock. But eventually, like most small subterranean tunnels, it just kind of petered out. At one turn, there was a dead end. The other was host to all kinds of stalactites and stalagmites. Those are like rock spike things you usually see on the roofs of caves, only you get them on the bottom too, in most places. I'm checking out the stalls to see if there's a possibility of us twisting through them to get to the deeper sections of the tunnel, when I hear my cousin whisper something behind me. Something that honestly made my blood run cold. He said he could feel water on his back. Something was dripping on him. As it turns out, while everyone was having a good old time outside, checking out the statues and whatnot, it had started to rain. Only they neglected to tell us that. So thanks, guys. It's also worth noting that the tunnel we were in had sank down into the rock for a little while before sort of flattening out at the bottom. And to save you all a little geology lecture, I'll get to the point. The tunnel we were in was filling up with water. Granted, it was filling up slowly, but the position we were in meant that only a few inches of water could effectively drown us. And that's a real bad position to be in if you don't own a pair of gills. Needless to say, we turned around as fast as we could, which took like the longest time when you factor in how narrow the tunnel was. Then began the long, slow crawl back along the flat part of the tunnel. It was absolutely horrific. I tried to keep as calm and collected as I could, but hearing my cousin almost cracking up in front of me is something that still makes me shudder to think about. My biggest fear was that he would just lock up, which scared people are prone to do during particularly grueling caving sessions. For some reason, the brain just decides it doesn't want to take the body any further. And that's that. They can be stuck down in the rock for hours before they're calm enough to keep going. I was terrified he would just lock up, not move, and be the reason we both drowned down there, dying while our family laughed and joked in their marquee tents. But he didn't. That magnificent bastard kept his cool, relatively speaking anyway, and just pushed on. That doesn't mean it didn't get pretty close. It was horrendous feeling the water slowly rising around us, seeing little drops turn into trickles, each new one causing my heart rate to speed up and my adrenaline to surge. By the time the tunnel started to turn upward, back towards the main entrance, the water was almost up to my lips. Moving made these splashing noises, and both of our sets of clothes were completely soaked through. That little incident caused a ton of crap for the remaining 2 days. My aunt and uncle blamed me for almost getting my cousin killed, and they pretty much took it out on my parents for allowing me such a dumb hobby. We didn't go back into those caves at all, and to be honest, it took me a few months before I even thought about caving again. It hasn't put me off entirely, and I think it did me some good to become a little more safety conscious. But you can bet your butt that I check the weather before caving now. Every single time. And if it even looks like it's going to rain, don't do it. It's just not worth losing your life over, no matter how amazing it is. Right after I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I needed work. Real bad. I'd have done pretty much anything for rent money about that time in my life. So I'm lucky, or unlucky depending on how you look at it, that the local cemetery needed employees. At first, the old-timers who had been working there for 20 or 30 years just wondered why someone so young would ever want to be a gravedigger. It was tough work, terrible on the lower back, but I soon adjusted, and it turned out to be something more akin to a free gym membership than an actual job. I mean, I got swole pretty fast. If I'm being honest, it only ever felt like work if the weather was bad, or we had an actual funeral on site. Otherwise, it was just nice to be able to spend some time outdoors. So the way our cemetery was set up was pretty simple. The majority of the grounds were just regular grave sites. All pretty much the same size and same price. But the northwest corner of the grounds was a private site that contained much larger plots. These were reserved for much wealthier families, and the local undertaker made a lot of cash from selling extravagant grave setups to them. I'm talking whole mausoleums, statues of angels, stuff like that. We hardly ever visited that area of the site, except for cleaning and maintenance duties, and those were never left to me. I didn't take it personally, but the older guys just didn't trust me with all the cleaning chemicals and whatnot that kept the marble and brass fixtures looking fresh, which is why it was so weird when I got a phone call one of my days off asking me if I had been up to that area recently. My boss was livid. I could hear it in his voice, and he pulled no punches when he asked me if I had been screwing around in the northwest plots. Of course, I told him no, that the last time I had been up there was to watch one of the old-timers using the marble cleaning chemical as part of my training, and that had been months back. He sighed, seemed confused, and was confounded. So I asked him what exactly the issue was. He replied that it could wait until the next time I was at work. I was worried, sure, but I was pretty sure that I hadn't done anything wrong. Not deliberately, anyway. And especially nothing that involved the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I rolled into work, the atmosphere was tense. I knew something fairly serious had happened. All I knew, I wouldn't have to badger anyone to find out why. The boss man walked me out to the northwest plot, silent the whole way, and I knew better than to open my mouth until I found out exactly what was going on. There was already a worker up in the plot, tending to one of the graves. That's when my boss told me that if I had been hanging around the area, maybe during my lunch break, eating a few snacks among the opulent grave sites, now would be the time to tell him. I swore up and down that I hadn't, that I knew better than to eat stuff near the graves, as I had been well informed it attracts wild animals that can in turn do damage to some of the resting places. That's when he broke it down for me. Something had tried to dig up one of the freshly dug graves out in the northwest plots. He said something in particular, and not someone, because we each had enough experience to recognize when a grave had been dug with tools, or by hand, or in this case, by claw. It was rough around the edges, obvious claw marks in the dirt, as opposed to the straight lines carved out by a shovel. This was something of an emergency. I mean, for obvious sanitary reasons, but for sentimental reasons too. If local families discovered that wild animals were trying to dig up their deceased relatives, there would be an uproar. Something had to be done, and quickly. A meeting was called among the gravediggers and attendants. As far as we knew, the mysterious digging had taken place overnight, and was most likely undertaken by some kind of scavenger animal, a coyote, a black bear, maybe even an escaped dog. The solution was obvious. Night watchmen would have to be present in the cemetery every night until the situation was resolved. And guess who voluntold to be the night watchman for the first full week? You guessed it. The young guy. The new guy. Me. The only thing that made the proposal even vaguely attractive was the fact that anyone doing the night work would be paid double the regular rate, and I could definitely have done with the extra cash. The first night of being on watch really sucked. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a 22 pellet gun loaned to me by one of the other workers to take down any varmints. It was long, boring, and lonely. But once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it got a little easier. Then, on the second to last night of my watchman duties, I was on a little foot patrol, walking up towards the northwest plot, with a flashlight in my hand. That's when I saw it. A flurry of frantic limbs, digging at the earth. I could have shouted something, maybe even fired the 22 into the air to scare the animal away. But something in me wanted to end this whole thing right then and there. If I killed whatever critter was causing us so much trouble, I might be out the extra pay, but at least I would have my daytime life back. I crept up slowly, turning the flashlight off and sneaking stealthily towards the dark shape, working away at the earth. I have hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figured I would use the old flashlight technique to cause the animal to freeze for a second, so I could take the killing shot. But when I did, when I aimed that powerful flashlight in the direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a human, crouched on all fours, digging away at the earth with his or her bare hands. I couldn't bring myself to aim the rifle. I was too shocked at what I was looking at, so all I did was start making as much noise as possible, telling them to get out of there, saying that I would call the cops if they didn't comply. They complied all right, but not out of fear. The look in that person's eyes was one of fury, pure anger that they had been interrupted in their obscene little act. I swear, if I hadn't had that rifle with me, I honestly don't know if I would be here today to tell this story. Needless to say, The other workers didn't believe what I saw. Some of them told me they didn't doubt that I'd seen something. They just disputed what that thing was. And I get that. I really do. But still, I know what I saw. And it was definitely a person. This happened for about 2 weeks in the summer of 2021. Back in 2021, my sleep schedule was very messed up. I'm talking about staying up till 3 to 5 a.m. almost every night, then waking up at 10 a.m. It was awful. I mention this because I probably would have never even seen this strange woman if it weren't for my awful sleep schedule. It was either Wednesday or Thursday at around 2:30 a.m. I was downstairs on my couch scrolling on my phone when I heard some type of clacking and speaking outside on the sidewalk right outside my house. I turned around and peeked through the blinds to see who would be walking around at 2:30 a.m. But when I peeked through, I saw this very skinny, blonde woman walking down the street whilst talking on the phone. But she was walking like her limbs were spongy. It was by far the most unsettling, unnatural thing I've ever seen. I was freaked out, and the last thing I wanted was for her to look at me or something. I thought, maybe she's just drunk or something and she's headed home. And the next day I told my friends about it, and then forgot about it. Fast forward 4 days later. It was probably around 4 or 5 a.m. I was playing video games in my room. I got really hungry, so I removed my headset and prepared to head downstairs to the kitchen. But as soon as I removed them, I heard an almost cartoonish meowing. We have 2 very friendly stray cats in my neighborhood, so I assumed it was one of them. I was worried one of them was hurt, since they never meow like this. So I look out my window to see if they're out there. But I almost gasp when I see her. She's inhumanly hunched over and meowing, scratching at the concrete. I can see her backbones poking out of her dress, and her arms seem so long. She must have seen the sudden increase of light coming from my window as she snapped her neck around towards me. Her eyes, she had them open freakishly wide, and her jaw dropped to its fullest extent, almost as if she was trying to scream, but nothing came out. Then before I can even take all of this in, she sprints on all 4s into my neighbor's backyard and disappears into darkness. I am scared beyond belief and think I am dreaming at this point. I just sit in my bed frozen until the sun starts to rise. I then fell asleep. I haven't seen her since, but the day after I went to the side of my house, and I swear I could see some slight marks in the concrete. The following week, I heard her heels clacking, but saw nothing. I haven't seen or heard her since those 2 summer weeks in 2021. And man, I really hope I never do again. My dad has some family in Mexico City, and my cousin who lives there was getting married. I'm not very close to my family in Mexico. I rarely see them, and those cousins are much older than me. My parents said I could stay home alone for 2 weeks. They decided I could stay home so I wouldn't miss school and be bored out of my mind. At 14 years old, this was a big deal for me, and my Aunt Dee Dee and godmother would drop by a couple of times and make sure everything was okay, and jokingly say to make sure I didn't burn the house down. Everything was normal, until this 1 week. It had been raining, and it was one of those storms with a torrential downpour. large hail, and very strong winds. To be honest, I really enjoyed storms like this. I was in the basement at the time, since a tornado warning was issued, and Chicago isn't prone to tornadoes. I figured it was better to be on the safe side. Our Ring camera kept chiming, and I assumed it was the wind setting it off, so I didn't bother to go check. All of a sudden, I heard a crashing sound outside, and thinking the patio furniture may have fallen over or something, I went upstairs to check it out. That's when I saw a person standing in the yard, looking directly at our kitchen windows, like they were trying to see if anyone was home, since all the lights were off. Our eyes met, and the smile the person gave me was so evil, and they started pounding on the window like they were trying to break in. I grabbed a knife and hit the alarm to call the police. Within minutes, the police showed up and told the person in the yard to drop the weapon and get on the ground. The cops pulled off the hood of the person, and it was a distant cousin who had a falling out with the family. She kept yelling that we stole her house, that we owed her money, and that she'll be back. And then she looked right at me and said, You'll be sorry. Do not forget this face." I knew she was on something. She has a long history of drug use, and when she's on drugs, it's like she's insane. I told the cops my parents were in Mexico, but they called my aunt and godmother, told them what happened, and they came to stay with me. While my parents were disturbed by what happened, they were proud of how calm I was, and I did stay home alone again from time to time. Turns out, this cousin had arrest warrants in another state, and she was transferred out of state to be charged with arson and armed robbery. It's been years since this happened, and I never saw my cousin again. Last I heard, she was in Texas with her biological mother, and I honestly hope she's doing better and changed her life around. This happened to me and my mom in 2015, when I was still a teenager. We were heading to our beach house, which was 2 hours away from my hometown. My mom liked to drive at night because there was no traffic. I didn't mind, and loved to listen to music or sleep during the trip. I remember it was a very chilly night, perhaps during winter. It wasn't unusual though, since we liked to stay at the beach no matter the season. So there we were, driving on a regular road. It was after midnight, and I was listening to my iPod. I remember hearing my mom say that the car was almost out of gas, but predicting we could still make the drive anyway. That didn't worry me much, since my mom is a great and responsible driver. She always handles her car very well, and never had any issues. Until this creepy, daunting night. After a while, I opened my eyes and knew exactly where we were. We've been driving along this road for as long as I can remember. Therefore, I knew by heart that we were about to take a sharp turn in a few moments. I closed my eyes again and dozed off. Then, I was suddenly shaken awake by my mom. Still groggy, I looked at her and at once could see she was worried, maybe even a little frantic. That was very uncommon since she's a very level-headed person and keeps her cool most of the time. Confused, I focused on what she was saying. She told me she had taken a wrong turn, and there had been no way back, for miles and miles. I scanned our surroundings. We were on a large dirt road with no signs of civilization in sight. The right road we should have taken would have been a busy highway, but this was a desolate, narrow path, with only trees around us. I tried my cell phone. No signal. I tried resetting the GPS my mom had for emergencies, but got no signal with that as well. We had absolutely no idea where we were, or where the car was headed to. The only familiar path was the road we had missed. We knew nothing more than that, never having been to the surrounding areas. As we drove deeper into the unknown, the road became narrower and more treacherous. The branches of the trees on either side of the road brushed against the car, creating an eerie and unsettling atmosphere. Anyone who has ever driven through woodsy areas at night knows the feeling I'm talking about. I could sense my mom's unease as she tried to navigate the car through the tight space, as well as keep an eye on the low fuel notice on the dashboard. She turned the AC off, and the car got really cold. It seemed like the road had deep ditches on both sides, and our car was going to get stuck at any moment. We tried discussing what to do, but by then, I couldn't keep calm anymore. The isolation and fear of an empty tank were too much for my panicky personality. I felt a lump in my throat and cried silently, while my mom tried to evaluate our meager options. After what felt like hours of driving, we finally reached a kind of clearing up ahead. My mom was relieved, thinking we had got somewhere with more cars, or literally anything else. But as we continued down the road, we realized it was only a dead end. True, it was a bit wider than the rest of the path we were on, but there was still no way to turn the car around without risking getting stuck in the ditches. Panic set in as we realized we were decidedly trapped. We were alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help or easily get back on track. I kept trying my cell and the GPS, but to no avail. My mom was also trembling by this point. She's very tough and prepared, but never anticipated getting stuck somewhere like this. In the worst possible moment, we heard a rustling in the bushes. I was so terrified that I couldn't focus on the trees at first, because I thought I would see something horrifying and collapse right there. My mom said something about turning off the car, hoping to remain hidden, but she didn't. We sat in silence for a moment, waiting for any sign of what was out there. It was terrifying. We were an easy target. 2 women stranded in a car with low fuel and no weapons of any kind. Those were my thoughts while I finally studied the woods around us, illuminated by the weak headlights. I saw no path, no opening, nothing. No sign or indication that this was someone's property. It had to be the wind, or maybe an animal that was making that unnerving swishing sound. I still remember how the non-stop chills ran down my spine as that feeling of dread consumed me. I was bawling my eyes out by that point, believing we would be attacked, die, or just never be found. Honestly, I really hope to never feel this vulnerable and frightened again. When we heard another noise coming from the trees, my mom quickly changed her mind and began to back up. Breathing deeply and fueled by a sudden useful fear, my mom finally managed to turn the car around. It was a sheer demonstration of control and driving skills, since that patch of road was so narrow and full of rocks that I could never have pulled it off. She then sped down the road we came. The fuel was almost gone, and the car was freezing from the lack of AC. I was shaking, not only because of the cold, but also the pure terror. We both cried from indescribable relief. We did discuss about how to prevent these things from happening next time, but the truth is, it could happen to anyone. I guess people should be prepared for all of the worst possible outcomes when driving. The beach was near enough now, and we spotted a gas station in the distance, but it was closed. Eventually, though, we did manage to arrive at our house, literally running on fumes. My mom made it to a gas station in the morning and got the news that she almost ruined the car. Thankfully, everything turned out okay. I will never forget the horror movie vibes of that dark, isolated, ominous stretch of road. The way it led to seemingly nowhere was also creepy, and I will never understand why it exists in the first place. Not only that, but the thought of all the unspeakable things that could have happened in the middle of those woods will forever haunt us when driving at night. What you are about to hear is a warning. I beg you, I implore you, please do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate from the warmer southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry. A call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds or any other animals, for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. One, animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And two, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. But either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I had been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. But thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. The point being, I know those woods really well. But some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I had managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I did not recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understate how jarring that was for me. To be somewhere I had been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight. So that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That, or the moss in the area, grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told myself there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I had never, ever seen in those woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I had spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I had never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean, it was old. As in, there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979. So just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anyone was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I'm not entirely sure. But for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that, every so often, the cabin did actually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. I saw what I am about to attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statuette sat atop a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. And I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin and into the night. The night. You heard that right. When I walked into the cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes, at least. That's what it felt like. Only when I burst through that wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back at home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're hearing this, heed my warning and do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. This began a few days before last year's Super Bowl. The cable box in our living room had been cutting in and out for almost a month. Under normal conditions, I wouldn't have paid much attention to it. I don't watch much television these days, even football. Besides, it worked most of the time, but my wife had invited some people over from work to have a Super Bowl party. I learned long ago, if I keep the wife happy, she'll leave me alone to fiddle around in the wood shop. I called into the cable company early in the week and made an appointment for after lunch on Thursday. When the day came, the repairman showed up right before the family was going to sit down for dinner. For a moment, I thought I saw smoke coming out of my wife's ears. There are only a few things she hates more. I knew better not to say a word. After, I showed the guy the location of the TV. We sat down to eat. After a quick meal, I retreated to the living room to watch the cable guy, and help if needed. He checked the box first and then moved on to the cables. He asked for access to the attic, and I led him to the hall and lowered the stairs. About 10 minutes later, he returned with a frayed section of cable. It appeared that some critter had been chewing on it. Once he replaced it, everything was fine. I thanked him, and he asked to use the restroom before he left. I said sure, and pointed him in the direction of it. My son and I were in front of the TV, fiddling with the channels for a while before I remembered the repair guy was still in the john. I didn't want to badger the fella, but he had been in there for a really long time. So, just to be safe, I politely knocked on the door and asked if all was well. No reply came, but a few seconds later, I heard a man's voice echoing from my daughter's bedroom. Naturally, I was curious and leaned over to peek in. The repairman was talking to my daughter at the connecting door. This scene slightly peeved me, but it seemed innocent enough. He was a young kid after all, but she was barely 16 years old, so I stepped in and shut it down. He kindly excused himself and made his way out of the house. From that moment, he ceased to exist in my mind. That was until April of the same year. I was on my way home from work when I got a frantic call from my wife. It took a minute to figure out what she was saying, but eventually I realized someone had tried to grab our daughter on her walk home from school. When I made it home a few minutes later, the cops were already on the scene and talking to her. My wife and I were both so frazzled, they asked us to sit calmly and listen while they questioned my daughter. I did my best, but when it came around to identifying the guy, I almost went through the roof. She described how she and another girl were just a few blocks from home, and a truck pulled up to them. The driver said hello, and my daughter recognized the guy. She walked up to the truck and started talking to him. She said he seemed really nice in the beginning, but when he asked her to go with him, and she declined multiple times, he got mad and attempted to pull her into the truck. Only because she fought so hard was she able to get free and run away with her friend. Finally, the officer asked her who the guy was, and she said that it was the very same cable repairman that was in our house. Now, I was beyond furious. I had treated that kid with respect, and he tries to kidnap my daughter. I could have thrown him out on his butt when I caught him talking to her, but I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt and think back to how it was when I was young. Even after I let him know that she was still too young for him, he tried to force himself on her. The officers did manage to calm me down and left to continue the investigation. The wife and I did our best to shift our anger into helping our daughter deal with the shock and trauma from the incident. We were all relieved to hear when the scumbag was arrested later that night. He had been spotted and pulled over by highway patrol that had heard the APB. Although he had done something very stupid, he was wise enough to take the offer put forth by the district attorney. Hopefully, when he comes out in 3 years, he will have learned to take no for an answer. Since the legal proceedings wrapped up, the rest of the family have made it our goal to help my daughter move past this. In addition to attending counseling alone, everyone else has joined her in 2 separate sessions to learn best how to make her healing process go as smoothly as possible. We all plan to be in attendance for her upcoming graduation. Providing her with this show of support in such a hard time is the best way I can think of to let her know that we've got her back. There was a time not long ago when her achieving this milestone was in question, but I attribute her same will to fight that saved her that day with driving her to move forward. I have never been more proud to be her father, and I hope she knows I will always be there for her, no matter the circumstances.